Hello everyone and welcome to today's members only live stream. We are so glad to have you with us today. We're so glad to have you, our members. You're an important part of what we do, and we love having these special programs just for you. And today we wanted to bring you somewhat of a focused look at historic sites in the U.S. and how they came to be. And this is very much in a nutshell, right? We could do an encyclopedia on all the different historic sites and all the different organizations that take care of them, that promote them, that preserve our own history. But today we're just going to give it a very broad overview. And of course, if you've watched these and you've watched me, you know that I like to go back to the beginning. And so I think we have to look at what we mean when we're talking about history or historic site, or even why these things are important. So I've got a quote today, the introductory quote to what is arguably the first history book in history, Herodotus. And Herodotus is a Greek historian. He was the first one to come up with the word history. And it's from the Greek historia, which means an inquiry or an examination, basically to track something down. And at the beginning of his book, he said, "Here are presented the results of the inquiry, or historia, carried out by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. The purpose is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time and to preserve the fame of the important and remarkable achievements produced by both Greeks and non-Greeks." And you have to remember that Herodotus is writing about a history of conflict between Greeks and non-Greeks, specifically Persians, but it's very interesting because he wants to preserve these things outside of living memory. He realizes that that is a limitation on what we can know of ourselves and of our own shared past. And so he's writing these things down, not just, as he says, from his own perspective, from the Greeks' perspective, but also for non-Greeks. He is looking for a total worldview. And this, through the centuries, Herodotus has been looked at by some as perhaps being a little too free with how he includes things. But from a modern perspective, it's the most modern thing we can do. He's looking at a total and holistic global approach to the past from a variety of different perspectives. We love that. So we are preserving the fame and important, remarkable things in our past. So we're moving not just to the written word, but to something that's more important for the purposes of our conversation today, which is the sense of place. And we all know what this means, but I want to talk about this for a second because it's going to define everything we discuss moving forward today. This sense of place is absolutely central to the desire and the hopes and the need to preserve historic sites, historic gardens, historic structures. They are a physical tie to the past. They represent something important that occurred. They represent an important cultural achievement. They represent somewhere where something happened, right? And these somethings can be as everyday as this is where the marketplace was in my hometown, to this is where the battle that decided the fate of a nation took place on these few acres of land. This sense of place is important nationally, in terms of local and regional communities, and in terms of we ourselves. I want you to think about where you grew up, right? It's that simple. Where you grew up. Close your eyes right now and imagine the house you grew up in, your front yard, your grandparents' place. That's that sense of place. That's important to us individually, and those things are important to us nationally. And so that's why it becomes important to preserve this sense of place. It is a direct tie to our past, individual or shared. So how and when did parks and historic sites begin? Well, again, going back to the ancient Greeks, they wanted to memorialize things that had happened. And this image is really neat. We've all heard of the Battle of Marathon. This is a battle from long ago, about 2,500 years ago. And to mark the site and to make it important, you see this photograph of this mound, this very obviously man-made mound there on the site of Marathon. Well, what is that? That is the mound where the Greeks buried their own dead from the battle. that mound marks the side of the battlefield and marks those who fell even today, 2,500 years after the event. If that's not a sense of place, and if that is not a historic site properly marked, I don't know what is, folks. And the things that go along with that too, this helmet shown in the photograph, it says Miltiades donated this helmet to Delphi. Miltiades was the general of the Greeks at this battle. So here you have an object placed in a site to preserve it, and you have the site itself preserved for this momentous event in Greek history and really Western history. That's sort of the beginnings of the idea of this sense of place and how the ancients memorialized them. And this is not unique to Western culture. This is not unique to the Greeks. This is something that happens throughout every culture and every past on the planet. We all begin to mark places where something important happened. But, things, as civilization grows, the different civilizations, the different cultures find different ways to mark these important places. And so the problem is, though, who owns the land, the place where it happened? And as we move from the ancient sites into the more medieval, some of the use of the land is what's important, right? The land has to produce something for people to live. It's agricultural societies. And so really, land is not seen as something communally shared. It's seen as something that can be productive, and generally the vast landholding estates are held by the social and political and economic elites of every culture. They tend to take parts of that land and set it aside for their own use in nature, whether it's hunting or whether it's going on strolls or picnics or things like that. They are at least preserving the land, but again, for the use of very much the elites. There is communal ground, there is communal property that is held, but it is almost always tied to the need for agricultural production. In England, they have, the commons, the areas where everyone's sheep could graze or things like that. But they also marked things for commemoration and atonement, even in the early Middle Ages. I have to bring in the Norman conquest here. For example, William the Conqueror, when he won the Battle of Hastings, wanted to mark the event and mark the site, so he built an entire church and an entire monastery on the site of the battle. And so it was marked with a sense of place, buildings were built on top of it, markers were placed, and there was a sense of atonement. He realized that in committing to battle, they were committing murder. Well, not murder, they were killing other humans, and so they wanted to have some sort of atonement for that. So the church seemed to be a perfect mix of saving the site, commemorating the site, making a monument to the site, and atonement. And so it goes, especially in Europe. But the idea of these parks for everyone didn't really exist in Europe, didn't really exist in Asia, didn't really exist until we come to the New World. And when it's a new world, there are new perspectives on things. And you have to imagine, when we say the New World, compared to Europe, which was considered sort of old and worn out, the land, even though there were lots of history things that happened, right? The land was generally virgin and fresh and new, and there were these millions of square miles of land that hadn't really been developed in any industrialized way. And so when Europeans first began to settle this area, they saw nature as something to be conquered, not something to necessarily be preserved. And this is important. Again, you have to think about their mindset. They're looking to make nature work and continue to help humanity thrive agriculturally and industrially and things like that. But there were certain people who realized that there were certain aspects of the land that had to be preserved for their natural and their cultural importance, even before independence was achieved by the United States. Now, again, Mr. Thomas Jefferson is an interesting figure. I'm not sure if it's really the first national park, but he did sort of have this idea that there were certain areas of the country that needed to be kept as they were, that needed to be marked, that needed to be preserved. And I've got a couple of quotes here. I'm speaking specifically of a place called the Natural Bridge in Virginia. And you can see from the photograph here, it's a natural bridge, right? It's a rock formation where a river has run through this area for eons and has basically burrowed a hole underneath, leaving a natural stone bridge. And when he first saw it, he writes about it in 1782. The natural bridge, the most sublime of nature's works, so beautiful an arch, so elevated, so light, and springing as it were up to the heaven, the rapture of the spectacle is really indescribable. And so he's seeing the beauty of this, and even after, so this is while the Revolutionary War is still going on, a couple of decades later, he's able to purchase this land. He actually goes and does a survey and purchases the land, gets the deed to the land where the natural bridge is. And he writes to that then, I have no idea of selling the land. I view it in some degree as a public trust and would on no consideration permit the bridge to be injured, defaced, or masked from public view. So he sees sort of his own responsibility as a way to preserve this for the public. It's very public-minded of Mr. Jefferson. And that sort of idea that individuals or groups of individuals could then come together and begin to preserve some of these historic sites is very much in place in the United States. People realize that there are, of course, at the time they sort of call them sacred shrines, right? Because this is where America was forged. Pennsylvania State House, or Independence Hall as we know it, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, places like that. People recognize that they were important places where fundamental things in our own past were all sort of developed and decided, and important things happened. And so they began to come together and try to save these as individuals or as groups. And so there's one great example of that, of course, and that's the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. They were formed in 1853 before the Civil War. Because this photograph, you can see, you may recognize it. This is Mount Vernon. This is George Washington's home. And in the middle of the 19th century, folks, it was in rough shape. It had passed through a couple of different folks in the Washington family, and something like this cost a huge amount of money to keep up, and they simply couldn't afford it. And so what happens is people realize this is an important part of the nation's past. And so the ladies come together as a group. They began to raise money to buy the property and to preserve it properly. And guess what? They're still around. When you go to Mount Vernon today, it is still the Mount Vernon Ladies Association who operates that site. When you pay your admission fees or they get a grant, that organization gets a grant to take care of Mount Vernon and its grounds. So that is a private organization still that's maintaining an important part of our past, and that's just one example. Another example, a little bit further south, but also tied to the American Revolution, is the Guilford Courthouse Battlefield Park. Right now, it's a national park site, but in the very beginning, a man and some of his friends decided that they wanted to purchase the land where the battle happened, and they had this really interesting idea that they would not just make it a park to commemorate the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. They wanted to make it sort of an attraction. They wanted to make it a place where people could come and have picnics. They wanted to create water features. They wanted to perhaps create horseback riding areas. They wanted to make it not just a commemoration of that battle, but sort of an all-encompassing commemorative site for the entire American Revolution in the South. And so you see a lot of monuments begin. This is one of the first monuments they placed there about Guilford Courthouse and the battle that took place there. But this was the idea. It was a private organization that incorporated and tried to make it into this beautiful park. Now, part of the problem that you find is that they tend to alter the landscape a little bit. They're not terribly concerned with pure preservation. They're looking at commemoration, and they're looking at ways where they can continue to make the thing financially sustainable on its own. So some things happened at Guilford Courthouse in terms of landscape. They built a pond, right? They made a big dig into where a creek comes in. They built a pond there that hadn't been there before, lots of things like that. But it's private efforts to create preserved senses of place. And this happens in a post-Civil War era. And by the time you get to the 1870s and the 1880s, you're getting this idea that maybe our federal and state governments should play perhaps a larger role in preserving some of these sites. And one of the highlighting moments is in 1872 when the United States government establishes Yosemite National Park. Not National Park Service Park, but a national park. And they do it specifically because of the unspoiled beauty of the area. Because folks like Theodore Roosevelt realized that with the energy of America in development and trying to exploit the land, remember, conquer nature, a lot of these pristine and beautiful places in the American West, which was still primarily owned by the federal government, its government land, should, at least, if you can't save everything, at least save pockets. So Yosemite was the first effort to try to create a place where nature and the animals that live there are going to be maintained as they were in their natural state from here to eternity. And so Yosemite sort of sets that pace, and it's not much later that they also began to establish things for national military and battlefield parks. And this is a really interesting aspect. The War Department is actually one of the first movers. Not a National Park Service, it doesn't exist yet, not the Secretary of the Interior, but the Secretary of War. The Department of War says we should get some of these battlefields, not just to commemorate, not just to preserve, but we can use them as study grounds, as a way to educate ourselves about military tactics and the lay of the land and things like that. So the first military battlefield park is actually not too far from here at the History Center. It's Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. And it was the first one, believe it or not. And it's really interesting. You go there today and you can see the monuments are very nice. And being the first one, everyone was all in. It's not just, regiments. Sometimes just companies have their own little monument there on the battlefield. And being the first battlefield park for the American Civil War, they also got first dibs on a lot of those surplus Civil War cannons that were still in federal stockpiles. And so when you go to Chickamauga today, one of the interesting things about it is, unlike other national parks, there's almost a 1-to-1 ratio for the number of cannon that were at the battle that are actually sitting on the park. It's not that way at other parks because they eventually started to run out of them, but just a little interesting side note there. Shortly after that, very shortly after that, they began some other ones. They looked at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Shiloh, and then they began other ones. They went a little further back in time and began to develop Kings Mountain and Yorktown and places like that. Again, these were under the War Department. National Forest began to take some of their forest area and set it aside for preservation. And the Department of Agriculture sort of did the same thing. But it wasn't until you're really at the peak of the Progressive Era in about 1916 under Woodrow Wilson's administration, in the midst of a world war, that the United States government actually legally and legislatively creates the National Park Service. And with the creation of the National Park Service in 1916, basically it says we're going to take some of these things and we're going to sort of consolidate them under the auspices of the Secretary of the Interior. And that means it's going to get a budget line item and things like that. And this is the real birth of the National Park Service. Now, national parks, of course, incorporate today the military parks, the historic sites, the recreation sites, the nature sites, and things like that. And that's important because it wasn't really seen that way in 1916. It was just sort of a way to reorganize government. Remember, this is the era of reorganizing government, making it more efficient, and that was one of the main driving points, not necessarily a good idea to make sure things are preserved. But in 1933, we get through World War I, and there's a lot of things going on in the 1930s. There's the Depression, and FDR is elected. And one of the first things he does is sign a whole bunch of executive orders where he's trying to get the economy back on its feet again. But here's an interesting thing. He signs an executive order, number 6166. It consolidates all the national parks. It's the Reorganization of 1933. And I want to make sure I get all this straight, so I'm going to have to read this to you. It consolidates national parks, national monuments, national military parks, national cemeteries, national memorials, and national capital parks into the national park system. Because there had been all these different things that the federal government was in charge of. The entire District of Columbia, the historic, the Capitol and the White House and things like that. The national cemeteries from the American Civil War and more recently from the Spanish-American War and things like that. They were their own thing. The national military parks were, of course, under the Department of War. Then there were the historic sites proper that weren't really related to wars or things like that. The monuments, sometimes they would just build monuments. And, of course, all the natural sites, the sites that were recreational and natural. FDR gets all these and puts them under that gigantic umbrella of the National Park Service. And even though 1916 is the legislative beginning of the National Park Service, this is really when it becomes the glorious and wonderful behemoth that it is today under FDR. And it wasn't just to reorganize and make it more efficient, it's part of the New Deal. Because in my opinion, one of the most fantastic aspects of the New Deal is the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is a huge program for the New Deal, one of the most successful. The idea was to take so many of these unemployed young men, give them jobs, federal government jobs, where they could actually learn skills and learn trades. But at the same time, it's the Conservation Corps. So they're going to be working on basically national parks projects, right? About half of all CCC camps were in a national park site. They're going to be making improvements to the natural parks. They're going to be renovating and making changes to the military parks. They're going to be building roads to these parks. They're going to be building visitor centers. They're going to be building campgrounds so folks can come and enjoy these. The Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Park Service are like this during the New Deal and the Great Depression. And the amount of work and the amount of effort that the CCC puts into all of these historic sites, it's just unimaginable. I think we've mentioned before, for example, at the Chickamauga battlefield, you go there and they have, log cabins and structures that sort of represent the cabins and structures that were, those aren't original to the Civil War. All those were built by the CCC. And folks are learning skills. And a lot of state and federal parks were either created or turned into places people could go during this administration. And it's important to note that from a national perspective, this is all happening because of legislation and executive orders. They're sort of taking the good ideas that existed before that these private groups and organizations were doing, and they've nationalized it to put more force behind it, to put more resources into it. That's the idea of the progressive movement, right? So between the time of the Great Depression, of course, we come through another world war, and then America really kicks into that post-war consumerism, great big economy. And one of the things that happens with all the new Eisenhower interstate system is people want to go visit places. They want to learn more about their history. They want to take the family on a week's vacation to Yosemite or Yellowstone or something like that. So the National Park Service begins to grow, and every president has added to it. But some of the most recent ones have added a lot of different historic sites, sort of making sites that hadn't been pulled into the mainstream, important historic sites, whether they're a monument or a historic site or things like that. So you can look at this first graph, and you can see how much land the National Park Service now has today. 85 million acres the National Park Service is in charge of, with 68,000 square kilometers of archaeological sites, 27,000 historic structures. Those all have to be maintained, by the way. 21,000 other buildings, 12,000 miles worth of trails, and 8,500 miles worth of roads that the National Park Service now has under it. Now, that's not all historic sites. Some of that's those pestery recreational and nature sites with the bisons like Yellowstone and places like that. But that's okay. We love them too. They're not necessarily historical. But here on this next graph, you can see sort of the breakdown. You can see how many of these parks are, historic site. Now, of course, the biggest chunk of it, the national parks, the nature preserves, make up about 52 million of those 85 million square acres. Square acres. That's because they're trying to get as much of the watershed and the environmental part of those parks incorporated as possible. But you can still see the number of historic sites, military parks, and structures is way more. We've got 138 national historic park sites, our international historic sites. We've got 25 military parks, and the National Park Service has to maintain each and every one of those. And when you start looking at the budget of the National Park Service, folks, it's not that big. It's actually kind of pitifully small. It's less than $3 billion. And $3 billion sounds like a lot, but when you have to pay 18 to 20,000 staff members, and you have to do all the maintenance, just the maintenance on these parks, the roads, the trails, fallen timber, things like that, it is a huge expense. And in my opinion, the National Park Service is vastly underfunded, but it is what it is. Now, spend the last little bit talking about National Park Service, but you have to remember it's not just national parks. Each of the 50 states in the Union do have their own park service as well, including right here in Georgia. We've got some great historic sites here in Georgia that come together. We've got New Echota, we've got Fort King George, Wormslow, the Martin Luther King Jr. historic site in downtown Atlanta. So all the states have budgets too that they're able to preserve the historic sites. But it's not just nationals, and it's not just state governments. There are privately operated sites and monuments too. Believe it or not, Colonial Williamsburg, that very popular place, is totally a private thing. That is privately owned, well, not even owned, it's privately held, privately funded, and even down to small historic cemeteries that local and old churches own. Those are historic sites too. And they're all tied to a sense of place. Some of them very significant nationally, some of them just significant locally or individually, but they're still historic sites. And this is one of the great things about our country, and one of the great challenges we all have, is we want to preserve as much as possible, but is it possible to save everything and preserve everything? Sadly, it's not. But we have to depend on the resources that we have, whether they come from federal, state, or local governments, or even from the kindness of individuals such as yourself, to maintain the historic footprint physically so that we can always have this sense of place. Of course, we think it's very important. We know that you think it's very important. But, when it comes down to it, really, what is the best historic site? I'm going to say it's the Northeast Georgia History Center. Hopefully, if you've been watching, you're going to think that too, or at least you're going to think you're up there. You may not have been able to visit here before. We highly encourage y'all to do that. And I'm only saying this tongue-in-cheek, because if you're like me, and you probably are, visiting all these historic sites that hopefully you know a little bit more how they came to be, it's really emotional and it's really visceral. It's one thing to read a book about history, and trust me, I've got over 2,000 volumes in my house. I read a lot of history, but when you go to those places and you stand where these folks once stood, and you can see the land, and you can maybe even touch the buildings that they were in, and there's just something about that, and it's so important that we preserve that we do the best that we can to make sure that those incredibly and infinitely valuable resources are passed on to future generations, which you help do because you're members. We appreciate all that you do for being members. We, of course, have our monthly donation goal that hopefully you'll be able to contribute to a little bit. But until next time, that's all the time we have. Again, this is in a nutshell, and I could spend a long time, but Libba's already given me the nod that that's long enough, Glenn. So we're going to go ahead and say goodbye, and thank you very much for this Friday's Members Live Stream. It's always great having you be here with us, and until we can see you next time, stay safe, take care, and I hope to see you at the History Center soon.